Hey guys, hope you all are doing well out there. We are on day 2 of our slavery unit. And recall that yesterday was just a background on the slave trade and how that operated, the triangular trade, if you recall. Today, we're going to now zoom specifically into what like daily experiences were like for enslaved people. So I want to just start with a stop and jot. So if you could just pause this and jot down in your social studies notebook, what do you already know about what daily life was like for an enslaved person? Okay, I'm going to assume that you got some ideas down. That's just always a really important thing before you study anything, is to kind of take stock of what you know already, and then you can see what new things you learn. Okay, so we're going to study this over the next 2 days, just specifically what like kind of the daily life was like, and there might be some things you're already familiar with. There might be some new things in there. I'm just going to try to cover some of the like the big stuff. Okay. And the assignment today is going to look at primary sources written by some formerly enslaved people. Okay. And remember that the advantage of primary sources is those are people who have experienced whatever event it is you're talking about. So we're studying about slavery. That means if these are primary sources, that means these are people who were enslaved that are actually sharing, in their own words, what they experienced. So it is a very useful look into a topic when you can get primary sources. So that's going to be the assignment. But before we dig into that, I'm going to give some background just to kind of give you an overview. So let me pull up some notes. So I just thought I'd start by showing these two pictures. This is a specific plantation in Louisiana called, I think it's pronounced the Destrehan or Destrehan, something like that. And I wanted you to just kind of see right off the bat that the slaveholder and the enslaved people lived in different houses, different buildings, right? On the same land. But this is the mansion that the slaveholder used to live in. Now, this is a current day picture of the building, but obviously slavery's been abolished for many, many years. So, but this is the same house that the slaveholder used to live in on that plantation. And obviously you can see it's massive. It's very well constructed. It's very fancy. And then just scroll down a little bit here so you can kind of see it more. All these kind of essentially like shacks are where the enslaved people stayed on the property. And again, you can notice they're much smaller. They're very small. You can see that the walls aren't in the best shape. You might notice that they're on like stilts of sorts, not like an actual foundation there. And to be honest, these are actually in better condition than some other pictures I've seen. But I thought I'd pick these two because you probably can't see this little description here. It's really small. But this picture was taken from Beyonce's visual album Lemonade. If you're familiar with that, essentially the album draws pretty heavily on research she did about her own family's past and the actual plantation where her ancestors were enslaved, on that plantation and lived there. And it was this plantation. And so she used this picture in that video album. And in general, that album really addresses in a lot of ways that history and how that has impacted her family for generations, and how she feels like she and her own relationship with Jay-Z have been impacted by just that history that their family has experienced. So again, you can just see that, one of the major reasons we study this topic is because it has had such a massive impact on our country, and it still is impacting us today. So I wanted you to see those two pictures just so you can get a visual look at some of the differences. But we're not just looking at housing. That is part of it. So the three big areas I thought would be best to touch on up here are work, housing, and family life. Because I think that those are a few of the big things that in general, when you're just sort of like getting to know somebody or you ask about somebody, you might think, okay, these three things, where do they work? Where do they live? What's their family situation like? So today I'm just going to cover the first two, and then tomorrow we'll dig deeper into family life. So I just have some sort of very quick notes here that's going to give this general overview. Most, or many at least, enslaved people worked on cotton plantations, okay? And the work they had to do each day was, clear the field, plant new seeds. When it was harvesting, pick the actual cotton off the crop, clean the cotton and separate it so it can be sent and be usable. Oftentimes this was done entirely by hand, or with like minimal tools that they could use for some of these tasks. So really exhausting work, very exhausting work. And even if it were like 8 hours a day, which is what our normal work day is, it would be pretty brutal, backbreaking labor. Many enslaved people had to work 18-hour work days, right? That is the vast majority. That leaves you like 6 hours to sleep if you go to bed right after, which probably you have some other stuff you need to do before you go to bed. So that's very brutal. Not everybody worked for a full 18 hours, but many did. And if not 18 hours, close to that. And 6 days a week too. So it wasn't a 5-day work week like we have now, but it was 6 days, only 1 day off on Sunday. It was not uncommon for children to have to work too. Sometimes as young as 3 or 4, they would find sort of easier tasks for young children to do, but they think, their mentality, the slaveholder, was, let's get some kind of use out of them, right? They're again, we talked about the greed, right? They're trying to get as much money as they can. So they're trying to put everybody to use. Whipping was a common form of punishment for all kinds of things, whether it was just like if they didn't feel like the enslaved person was working hard enough, or or they disobeyed a rule, or so a brutal form of punishment. And this is just a detail to be aware of, that there were some who did not work out in the fields. Some worked in the house for various jobs, such as like looking after the slaveholders' children, maybe cooking, cleaning, things like that. There's a whole nother topic we could go into, that typically if you were lighter skinned, you had a higher chance of working in the house. And there's a whole history behind that. And that in itself has had a whole big set of impacts on our country since, but I don't feel like I have the time to go enough in detail about that on this particular lesson. The second topic for today, housing. You've already seen a picture, so just some extra details here is that, like I said, it was separate housing from the slaveholder, so the slaveholder could still have really nice, comfy house, and so that he felt like he wanted to spend as little money as he could on the housing for the enslaved people on his plantation. They were often simple shacks, like the ones we saw. Actually, at least, like I said, were on stilts and had some kind of floor. It wasn't uncommon for some of them to have no floor, and you just had to lay on the dirt floor, which is of course dirty, but it's also cold. You got to keep that in mind. Oftentimes they did not get very good food, so disease from malnutrition was very common. And this is one of the more devastating facts, is that more than half of the children, just barely, over half the children would live to 10 years old. Okay, so we're talking about almost half of the kids dying before they're 10 years old. Just awful. So that's work, that's housing, and then our examples today of what you're going to do for the assignment are all going to deal with work and housing. In fact, I'm going to model it with work. Yes, I'm going to model it with work, trying to remember. And then you guys, when you do the assignment, are going to do it more with something that's focused on housing. Okay, and then tomorrow we will talk about family. Okay, so again, you're going to use a primary source. And really what I'm looking for is an important skill when reading any source, but especially a primary source, is it's pulling out key details and then kind of summing them up into a main idea. So I will show you real quick. This assignment looks exactly like what you're doing, but it's a different text, okay? So make sure you're kind of watching what I'm doing here and you know how to do it when you do it for the assignment. So first of all, you're just gonna answer who wrote it, because that's important to be aware of. And we know it's about Solomon Northrop. I'm just gonna read a little bit of the background to make sure he is the one who wrote it. because he may not have been the one who wrote this source. So it says Solomon Northrop was born a free black man in New York. As an adult, he was kidnapped and sold into slavery for 12 years. He was finally returned to freedom through the efforts of New York's governor. Oscar-winning movie 12 Years a Slave is based on his life. That's another very brutal movie. And it says below is an excerpt from his autobiography. He describes what it was like working on a cotton plantation in Louisiana. So first of all, we did see there that this is from his own autobiography. So that means he wrote it. So I'm going to go ahead and put for who wrote it, Solomon Northrop. And I already got the answer to my second question is, what is the letter about? I mean, I'll just point it out again. It says he describes what it was like working on a cotton plantation in Louisiana. So I'm just going to put it in my own words and simplify it. So working conditions for an enslaved person is the focus. So topic is just kind of like what very generally are they talking about? Okay, now I'm going to have to actually read the source so that I can find what I think are the 3 to 4 key details, and then ultimately turn that into or sum that up as a main idea. So I'm going to start reading it, and I'm just going to be thinking the whole time about what are the most important details I'm seeing here, and I'm learning about what it was like to work on a plantation. Okay. The day's work over in the field, the baskets are carried to the gin house where the cotton is weighed. No matter how fatigued and weary he may be, no matter how much he longs for sleep and rest, a slave never approaches the gin house with his basket of cotton, but with fear. So he never approaches it without feeling fearful. If the basket falls short in weight, if he has not performed the full task appointed him, he knows he must suffer. Okay? So you're going to get in trouble if you didn't pick as much as you were supposed to. But it says, and if he succeeded it by 10 or 20 pounds, so if you picked more cotton than you were expected, in all probability, his master will measure the next day's task accordingly. So basically, you're going to be expected to meet that every single day from now on. So Northrop says, so whether he has too little or too much, his approach to the gin house is always with fear and trembling. Most frequently, they have too little, and therefore they are generally not anxious to leave the field. After weighing, follow the whippings. So basically, if you didn't have enough cotton, you would get whipped. And then the baskets are carried to the cotton house, and their contents stored away like hay. Why don't I go ahead and stop and see if I can grab a detail or two there. In fact, actually, this would be a good time. I'm going to pause and have you guys jot down from that paragraph what was the most important detail that you learned about. Go ahead and write that down in your social studies notebook. Okay, I'm going to assume that you guys got a detail down. To me, it's kind of like the whole middle of that section was about the fact that when an enslaved person brought their cotton to be weighed, they were often scared because it could be bad for them if they had too much or too little. So there's one important detail. Now, I'm just going to look over real quick and just see if I want to grab a second detail from that. I'm going to go ahead and add, because I think this is important to be aware of, about the actual whippings, because that is also like a really brutal part of the working conditions. And so I'm trying to pull out what seems most important. That's important because it's showing you just how difficult this was. So I'm going to put, if they didn't pick enough cotton, they would be whipped. Okay, I'm going to try to find 4 details here. I'm going to want to go the extra mile here and do the best I can. So I'm going to keep going and see if I can find a couple more in this paragraph. This done, the labor of the day is not yet ended by any means. Each one must then attend to his respective chores. One feeds the mules, another the swine is pig, another cuts the wood, and so forth. Besides, the packing is all done by candlelight. Finally, at a late hour, they reach the quarters, that means where they're staying, sleepy and overcome with the long day's toil. Then a fire must be kindled in the cabin, the corn ground in the small hand mill, and supper and dinner for the next day in the field prepared. All that is allowed them is corn and bacon, which is given out at the corn crib and smokehouse every Sunday morning. Each one receives as his weekly allowance 3.5 pounds of bacon and corn enough to make a peck of a meal. That is all. No tea, coffee, sugar, and with the exception of a very scanty sprinkling now and then, no salt. So I'm going to try to find some more details here, and I'm going to focus again on more on the working part, right? Because that's kind of my bigger focus. So even though they talked about like the quality of food they got and how it wasn't that much, I'm not going to kind of highlight those as the key details, and I'm going to focus more on the things they had to physically do, right? That's my focus. So I'm going to go ahead and pick out 2 more things I thought was important. After all their work in the field, the enslaved person still had to do chores afterward. And then I'm going to put then, because then after the chores were done, you notice, you know, Northrop said like, we'd be tired, exhausted, you know, so ready to go to bed, but you still had to make dinner and eat, right? Even though it's late and you're exhausted. So then put after chores, the enslaved person still had more to do. They had to prepare dinner, right? Because it's not like the slaveholder gets and his family get their meals cooked for them, prepared for them. They're not getting that treatment. They still have to cook their own meal and get everything ready even after they're exhausted like that. Okay. I'm just going to read this last bit here. It says, an hour before daylight, the horn is blown. Then the slaves arouse, wake up essentially, prepare their breakfast, fill a gourd with water, in another deposit their dinner of cold bacon and corn cake, and hurry to the field again. Then the fears and labors of another day begin. And until its close, there is no such thing as rest. So that doesn't, really add a lot of new details other than it's it's an important paragraph. It's just helping you see that like, then you finally get to bed and you wake up and you have to do the same thing over again, that same difficult day, right? And that paragraph is going to help me, kind of really think about what my main idea is going to be. But let me bring you down and have you look at these key details. And to explain, when we talk about main idea, what I mean is that it's kind of summarizing all the big things you learned into one point. If you had to boil it down to one big thing that you feel like kind of covers everything, that's the main idea. Okay. And again, the trick of it is you have to feel like the statement really explains sorry, I had a typo. It has to kind of cover all the key details, or at least most of them, because that's what makes it a main idea, is that you look at all the key details throughout, and this is the big idea that they all relate to. Okay. So it's a complete statement, and the statement has to kind of cover or summarize all or most of the key details all together. And so I want you to look at these 4 key details, and I want you to pause and jot in your social studies notebook, what would you say is the main idea? What is a statement you could make about, I learned this about what life is like for an enslaved person? That kind of covers all those details all in one statement. Go ahead and do that now. Okay, I'm going to assume you've gotten that. And so I'm going to share what I came up with, is that I felt like really the whole thing is focusing on how enslaved people kind of just had to constantly live in fear and exhaustion. Those are the 2 ideas, and I can put those 2 together into a statement. Those are the 2 ideas that I kept seeing throughout this entire section here. And I think that Northrop does kind of helps me out a bit by summarizing it at the end right here. Then the fears and labors, labor means work, and labors of another day begin. So even he's kind of pointing out, like, this is what I'm trying to show you, is that this is every day, fear and exhaustion from work. So that's what I'm going to put for my main idea. I'm going to put, so I want to word this well, a day, each day for an enslaved person is often filled with fear and exhaustion. And if I want to be a little bit more stylistic, or, you know, kind of play up a little bit more, make you, I guess, feel the impact of it a little bit more, I could go even more and say, from sun up to sundown, a day for an enslaved person is often, I'm going to put, because again, this draws more emphasis, almost every moment in the day for an enslaved person was often filled with fear and exhaustion. So that's just if you want to take it to another level and you want to emphasize things a little bit more fully. I said from sun up to sundown, almost every moment in the day for an enslaved person was often filled with fear and exhaustion. So that's what you're going to do today. You have a different primary source that's focused more on housing conditions, but you're going to do the exact same thing. You're going to fill that out. You're going to look for the key details and then summarize it up in a main idea. Okay. And I also have a recording of me reading that primary source out loud. So if that's helpful to you, you can click on that and listen to it as you read along and complete the assignment. Okay, sorry this one's a little bit longer today, but there was some important stuff I want to make sure we got down. So message me if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a great day, guys.